Hello, fellow planeswalkers and YouTubers. It is Alex with MadCity MTG, and today I've got a very cool video to share with you all. A pretty exciting moment for the channel here, as I'm going to present the first deck tech for the new channel. And of course, I'm going to be doing it with my favorite format, which is Modern. And today I've got something pretty spicy for the first deck tech. Figured I'd share a blue-white Miracles list that I've been working on for a while. And keep in mind, I actually built this back before companions were ever even spoiled. So back before, obviously, Ikoria, this was built back before Theros Beyond Death dropped and all that. So it hasn't been updated since then, but I don't think that there's a lot to really update. There's a couple cards that could get thrown in here, a couple flex slots, but for the most part, the list is pretty tight because it all kind of depends on each other. So without further ado, let's get into the deck itself. And of course, we're going to start with the namesake of the deck, the Miracles. And we run a 4 of Terminus. So this card is really important for the deck. We're always casting it for 1 white, unless it's super late in the game we have to sweep the board at sorcery speed, but really we want to miracle this at instant speed and wipe our opponent's board. So super critical card, and it's a definite 4 of. Now, unlike many current modern miracle lists, I am running another miracle, not just Terminus, but Temporal Mastery. And this is, again, a little bit that's something that sets the deck apart from other miracle lists, other control lists, especially with this version because it has a sense of inevitability. And you get that through extra turns with Temporal Mastery, and then it's good buddy Time Warp. So those are the high-end spells of the deck. For support, to help us set up those miracles, to help us dig and fix our hand, we've got 4 copies of Serum Visions. We've got 2 copies of Opt, again to help us cast our miracles at instant speed. So you can do it, before damage is dealt, during the opponent's combat step. You can do a Temporal Mastery at the end of their turn to set up a couple different turns in a row, that sort of thing. So instant speed card draw is pretty important because, again, it lets us cast those sorceries at instant speed. And then a couple Peak, which is a little bit different than Opt. You'll find out in a little bit about why I wanted the variety, but I think it's good to have a variety when it comes to these cantrips. So speaking of variety, one thing that helps us get a lot of value out of that variety is Snapcaster. One of the best cards in Modern, one of the best blue cards ever printed. Not a lot needs to be said, except for the fact that he'll copy any of these spells right here, including Time Warp. That's probably one of the biggest spells that he can copy, or a flashback from the graveyard. Even at sorcery speed, though, sometimes we'll get a Serum Visions, but obviously Opt and Peak are really helpful, and we get some extra cards out of those. So 2 Snapcaster. It feels like you want to probably go more, but really, as you'll find out, in this list, there are actually a lot more permanents than a lot of control lists. So while it plays like a traditional control deck in the sense that it's waiting for the long game, there's actually a lot of really aggressive plays early on in the game. So, and not a whole lot of actual controlling aspects, as you'll see in just a moment. So Counter Magic, Counter Suite is mild but powerful at a couple different levels. So we've got a couple remands. Again, amazing with Snapcaster. We've got the amazing upgrade from Modern Horizons, which is Force and Negation. One of the cards that really makes decks like this viable. And then we've got the Swiss Army knife of Modern, which is Cryptic Command. So another amazing card that is seeing more and more play as the format slows down a little bit. And you can actually play 4-mana counter spells again in Modern, which is great. Now, as I mentioned before, these are all the, aside from Snapcaster, these are all the instants and sorceries that we have in the deck, which, again, is far fewer than a lot of typical blue-white control lists. So, to supplement that and the deck, we run a full set of Teferi Time Raveler. So this card is amazing at any point in the game, but again, in this deck, one of the more aggressive things you actually want to do is play this. You just want to kind of slam this on turn 3. It doesn't really matter what your opponent is doing. I mean, it's awesome to have Force and Negation as a backup, but really you want to slam this on turn 3 as a distraction, as a way to tempo the game out a little bit, slow your opponent down, get them playing at your pace. And it helps in a variety of ways. Obviously, they can't cast anything at instant speed, so as a control player, you really like that benefit. But we also get really, really aggressive with the -3. I know a lot of people like to plus when they play Teferi, keep them out of bolt range or whatever the case may be. But our goal is to basically disrupt the opponent a little bit on turn 3 and get a card off of it. So bounce whatever, even if it's against a super aggressive deck and they've got a board full of creatures, slam Teferi down, bounce one of their creatures and get some sort of advantage out of it and provide a little bit of a distraction. And again, if they maybe go for the kill, so be it, but hopefully you have some sort of Force and Negation backup to stop some shenanigans. So full 4 of Teferi, very important card. And then we've also got 2 Jace the Mind Sculptor. And pretty much everybody knows what Jace does, but this is a Japanese version, but he is one of the more powerful planeswalkers obviously ever printed, and even in today's modern meta, I think it's really important. And of course, in the Miracles deck, with the 0 ability, which is basically brainstorming, you're able to put cards back on top of your library in any order, which then allows you to Miracle into them on your opponent's turn. So really a good card for the mid to late game as far as setting up your Miracles and getting that whole train rolling. And then we've got even more Planeswalkers in Big Tef. So the Hero of Dominaria. This is a pretty important card as well. I actually started with 3 and 3, but ended up going 4 and 2, because again, this is pretty much late game. You don't really ever want to cast this on turn 5 unless it's like an empty board, because you really want this card to survive. As opposed to Teferi, Little Tef, you're just kind of tossing him into whatever fray he might encounter. That's why you also have 4 of him. You can play one on turn 3, turn 4, keep the chain going, keep slowing down your opponent, distracting him with Little Tef, and then late game, you drop Big Tef. Obviously, drawing a card is amazing. Untapping those lands is excellent. Sometimes you can do some shenanigans even where if you have Little Tef and you're able to plus and play your next sorcery at instant speed, when you actually untap your lands during your end step, or at the beginning of your next end step, you can actually sometimes cast a Time Warp at instant speed before your turn is over, which then just gives you another turn. So really, really important Planeswalker. And then a really spicy card that probably I'm guessing that you haven't ever seen in Modern before, and it actually gives this deck the real sense of inevitability. And it's another Planeswalker, and it is Venser, the Sojourner. So I'll actually read this one because, again, it's an oldie but a goodie. So 5 mana, so it fits right in the slot of Big Tef. He starts with 3, so kind of a lower loyalty count for the cost, but still a really good card. So +2, which is a benefit, obviously, instead of just +1. Exile target permanent you own. Return it to the battlefield under your control at the beginning of the next end step. -1, creatures are unblockable this turn. -8, you get an emblem with whenever you cast a spell, exile target permanent. Now, the big combo here with Venser is involving a land in our deck. And if you play blue in Modern, you can probably guess what land that is. Mystic Sanctuary. So basically, again, the inevitability factor with Venser is the fact that you can just blink Mystic Sanctuary every turn and get back your Time Warp. So a lot of blue-white control decks, they win through attrition. They win through card advantage. They win by overwhelming your opponent after a certain amount of time. With this deck, it is a control deck at heart, but at the same time, it's aggressively trying to distract your opponent, creating a little bit of a tempo, and then finding your actual win condition. And it is infinite, or well, as many cards as you have in your library. And eventually, once you get his ultimate and get that emblem, you can really control the game, because anything that they had to get in your way is going to get exiled. So you can actually, technically, if your opponent doesn't scoop, you could finish with a flawless victory where your opponent has 0 permanents on board. So pretty cool. And he works. You might be skeptical. You might think, well, that's just another 5 CMC Walker, 5 CMC. That's not going to work, but it actually does. And even if he doesn't go off right away and you can't start chaining time warps, just blinking a land sometimes, blinking a Planeswalker to reset it. You can blink a Snapcaster if you have to, which isn't the greatest again, but he provides a nice distraction even if he doesn't really go off the turn that you play him. So, really good card. Now, on to the lands. So, as a control deck, we're running 24 lands, which I find to be a pretty good amount because, again, we have some cheaper spells, but we also have a lot of high-end stuff, and we really want to hit our land drops pretty much on turn. Every turn we want to drop a land, and we have some lands that are situational that we might not want to play all the time. We got fetches that we might not want to crack all the time, so lands are very important in this deck, as you'll see. So to start it off, we've got 4 Flooded Strand. Seems to make sense. Go get your island, go get your plains, go get your Hallowed Fountain, your Mystic Sanctuary, so on and so forth. Then we run a couple, or 3 extra fetches, all blue, because they all want to get Mystic Sanctuary and islands. But to throw off the opponent a little bit, you can run all the same blue fetch, but I actually mix it up a little bit, again, just to throw the opponent off, and so they keep them guessing a little bit as far as what colors you're really running. So we got the Polluted Delta, the Scalding Tarn, and the Misty Rainforest. And as I mentioned before, we got Hallowed Fountain, so this is a 3 of. I'm not super concerned about fetching and shocking. We're a control deck, so sometimes we might only win with 1 life left. But it's okay to fetch and shock, on turn 1 and take that damage even for a Serum Visions or something like that. But a lot of times they are played later in the game, tapped and or fetched tapped, so it's not a big deal to have 3. Next up is one of the linchpins of the deck, which is Mystic Sanctuary. And if you played Modern over the last year, you're very familiar with this card. As a common land and island, it really did change the game, especially for control decks. Being able to fetch this with any of those 7 fetches that I showed you, any point in the game, really, obviously if you have 3 other islands in play, is just so important when it comes to picking which spells you want to put back on top of your library, and just having that ability is amazing. And it obviously works really well with Miracles. So really you're almost never going to be able to do it with Temporal Mastery because it has the clause of exiling after you cast it, which is super unfortunate because, putting 1 on top of your library with Mystic Sanctuary is probably one of the coolest things you can do in Modern. But for the most part, we're bringing back Terminus. So again, a lot of common lines will be something like, oh, your opponent has a board full of creatures, they're about to swing and kill you, you have a fetch land, and another white source untapped. So you fetch, go get Mystic Sanctuary, put Terminus back on top, and then cast one of your instant speed draw spells, and then you basically just wipe their whole board in the middle of combat. Super frustrating to deal with, super easy for us to pull off, and that's really what will sometimes take this deck from almost dying on turn 3 or 4 to really taking it into turn 8, turn 9, where you're extending the game and really developing your game plan, and then at that point, your opponent is really playing catch-up. So, for Mystic Sanctuary, obviously it's also really good with things like Cryptic Command, where you can bounce it over and over again. It's really good with Time Warp. A lot of times I will just fetch as many times as I can in a row and take as many turns as I can in a row with the same Time Warp, as long as I have a Planeswalker in play to generate some value. Similar to the actual turns lists that are out there, we're not running things like Howling Mine or Dictate, but we are running cards that give us incremental advantage the more turns that we get. And obviously, eventually, if you can get a Venser out, you can just win the game. And you can just kind of take it out of nowhere. It could be, turn 6, turn 7. Your opponent really doesn't see it coming. They just got their board wiped by a Terminus, and then all of a sudden here you are going essentially infinite with Venser, Mystic Sanctuary, and Time Warp. So again, linchpin of the deck. It still functions without it, but it's a card that you want to have. So hopefully it doesn't ever get exiled. Field of Ruin, got a couple copies of those. Helps you fix your mana if you need to, and I guess it can take out some distracting lands. You know, obviously Tron, things like that. Maybe even Inkmoth Nexus, that sort of thing. It is, I guess, the most flexible land slot I have. You could throw in a Glacial Fortress, maybe a couple Seachrome Coast, that sort of thing. But I do like the fact that it can go get islands. It doesn't come into play tapped, and it can take out those problematic lands when you need to. So Field of Ruin is a really good card. Careful when you're shuffling, though, obviously. If you've got a Miracle on top, you're not going to want to Field of Ruin. Then we got one of Celestial Colonnade. As you probably noticed already, there aren't many beaters in the deck. We've got two Snapcaster Mages as our main creatures. Again, it doesn't really matter when you're going to wipe your opponent's entire board of their creatures. You know, whether it's a 2-1 or not, swinging in and attacking, you're going to get the job done with Snappy. If you don't, if they somehow get rid of it or exile it, you've got the one of Colonnade, which you will undoubtedly find, and it's a pretty efficient beater. I've even just won games where I play this, you know, turn 7, turn 8, and then just kind of control the game out with a more classic control approach, just stalling the game and getting it with Colonnade beats. So it gets the job done. It's the only land in the deck that comes into play tapped, which is also really good, and I think in this kind of shell where you still want to have the ability to put the pedal down, you know, and be aggressive, but at the same time, you're a control deck, so you can kind of pick and choose when you need to play those kinds of lands. Plus, you don't really want to run too many of these because you need your islands, and it's unfortunately not an island for Mystic Sanctuary. Speaking of islands, we got 6 islands and 1 plains. So pretty standard basic setup here. The 1 plains is in there. Just, you know, you got to have 1 basic of each color, in my opinion, for a variety of reasons. Anytime you need to fetch and not take a ton of damage, like with a Flooded Strand, or I guess a Path to Exile, that sort of thing, if you really need a white source, the plains is in there. And then the 6 islands go well with the 3 Hallowed Fountains to give us 9 plus 4 Mystic Sanctuary, so there's 13 islands in the deck total. So pretty good land count there, and so far I haven't really had any trouble with it. They could be snow-covered islands if you wanted to. Again, this deck was built, kind of designed before like Astrolabe was even really a thing that was dominating the format. So I didn't really factor in snow-covered islands much, and there's really not a huge need for it. You know, if anything, this might trigger your opponent, and they might think, well, why the heck isn't he running snow-covered? And that might actually throw them off more than a snow-covered would at this point, because snow-covered lands are just so common in Modern these days. So that's the land base. And then before we wrap things up, I'll go through the sideboard. So obviously, sideboard is meta dependent, and you really want to get a feel for the deck, base it on what is happening in your local meta. If you take it to a bigger tournament, play something a little bit more encompassing, that's going to hit the main decks the hardest, not necessarily what you expect to see, but you know, the main decks in the format at the time. So this hasn't really been updated, I should say, since Theros, maybe. But there's some good cards in here. I think, you know, there's a couple cards that have come out now that could potentially end up in the board, but it is what it is for now. So we've got one of Dovin's Veto, just a really good control spell, counter spell for those counter wars, or if you're going up against certain combo deck, ad nauseum, things like that. One of Brazen Borrower, and Petty Theft. Super versatile, another beater that can come in. It's a flying blocker, or, you know, to block things with flying, obviously. But it's just a good 3/1 flyer. Probably used to be a Vendilion click in the slot, but the versatility with Petty Theft on top of the 3/1 flying body is just too good to pass up. We got another copy of Force of Negation. So again, control matchups, counterspell wars, that sort of thing. Just good to have a third one to bring in, but didn't really ever feel like 3 in the main was right. Again, sometimes we want to be aggressive, and this is a very reactive spell in every sense of the word. Then we've got two of my favorite sideboard cards, which is Engineered Explosives. So 2 copies of that for a variety of decks. It hits 0s, 1s, 2s. As far as non-land permanents, we can put all 3 different settings. So, and it'll hit everything that we need to. And we don't really have much in play that it will affect, which is nice. It doesn't hit any of our walkers. I guess maybe a Snapcaster, but it's like probably worth it at that point. It's probably like a 3-for-1 at that point. Okay, explosives, and then surgical, of course. One of my favorite sideboard cards as well, and staple pretty much in a lot of modern sideboards, and pairs well with things like Snapcaster if you want to take out a couple different cards at once. Obviously, we can't pay for the black mana, but 2 life is not that big of a deal when it could potentially win you the game or save you from dying. Then we've got another pretty spicy card here, but one of my favorites, which is Shadow of Doubt. This is also a 2 of. Super flexible, great with Snapcaster. Obviously, you can catch people off guard with the fetch lands, especially coming out of the sideboard. And a lot of times, if you can even set them back like 1 turn with that land, or the missed land drop, they go to, crack their fetch land and you Shadow of Doubt them. Them missing the land drop and you drawing a card and putting an instant in your graveyard for Snapcaster, that can sometimes just be the separation that you need as a blue-white control deck to really take over the game. So, super fun card. Obviously, it works against a lot of other decks, though, like decks that want to search their library for a variety of reasons, which there are more and more of these days, especially with, like Grim Tutor being printed now. Suddenly, Grim Tutor is legal in Modern. It's the closest we're ever going to get to Demonic Tutor. And so you might see more decks that are really trying to just search for those combo pieces, and Shadow of Doubt feels pretty good in that sense, because they'll still lose 3 life from Grim Tutor. All right, Blessed Alliance. So another great versatile card here against burn, aggro decks, that sort of thing. I like it with Snapcaster as well. So we've got 2 copies of that to try to shore up those super fast matchups that, sometimes this deck will honestly kind of fold to. Like a mono red prowess or burn is tricky. We don't have things like Sphinx's Revelation, or other ways to really gain life, so sometimes having this out of the board can be a big help. Timely Reinforcements is another good option. I didn't really like that, though, with I don't really want to Terminus my soldiers, or whatever tokens they are from Timely, and I also like the fact that it's an instant, which plays really well with Snapcaster. So, Blessed Alliance. We've got a couple Ashiok, similar to Shadow of Doubt in a way, but just another body that can, kind of distract your opponent for a little while. A lot of people hate this card when they see it played against them, so they're going to be distracted at least for a turn or 2 while they try to go after it. And, it's not going to win you the game or take over the game, but it should stall enough to allow you to make up enough ground where you can pull ahead. And then finally, we've got 2 copies of Narset, and this card has proven to be really, really good in Modern. I think it comes in a variety of matchups. And again, it's hard to add more Planeswalkers, so I usually just kind of sub out 1 or 2 here or there when I do bring in either of the walkers. But usually never like all 4 get boarded in at once. Usually it's either Ashiok or Narset. I guess in the rare scenario you could put them all in and see how it goes, but for the most part it's going to be one or the other. So, as far as the board, though, again, super flexible, lots of slots. The main deck, though, is pretty tight. I've monkeyed around a little bit, tinkered around a little bit with the numbers, but it feels pretty good, feels pretty set where it is right now. So, if you guys ever want to try it on Moto, give it a shot. If you got the cards, it's a lot of fun to play. It doesn't really play like your typical blue-white control list or your typical Miracles list. Sometimes you end up hitting like a Temporal Mastery off the top out of nowhere, and it leads into a Teferi with your opponent having nothing on board, and it just feels really, really good. Other times you get the Mystic Sanctuary shenanigans going with the fetch lands and Time Warp, and it just feels like a really, really powerful deck when you're in control. And even when you're behind, it always still kind of feels like you kind of have your opponent on the ropes and you're ready to do something. And again, I think that comes with the inevitability of Venser. where your opponent might think that you're out of gas or you're out of options because maybe your hand isn't as full as a typical control deck, but then all of a sudden you just win out of nowhere with Venser. So very fun deck to play. I encourage you to give it a shot. Any questions, comments, that sort of thing, let me know. As the first deck tech, I want to thank you guys for sticking with it. It's about 25 minutes. I wanted to keep it around 20, but obviously I got talking a little bit. This is one of my favorite decks to play as well, so it meant a little bit more to me to present this as the first deck tech on the channel. But to continue seeing more content like this, please like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.